Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Ritu Sharma, psychologist and behavioral skills trainer, assistant professor psychology, Amity University. This module we will be discussing about role of criminal psychologist and scope of criminal psychology. By now you are aware of psychology, theories of criminal psychology and history of criminal psychology. The objective of this module is to study about the role of a criminal psychologist and scope of criminal psychology in today's era. The topics which are included in this module are criminal psychology as a field, topic number 2, role of a criminal psychologist, which is profiling, psychological testing, predicting behavior and attitudinal, developing correction system, experimental, advisory. It also covers and entails scope of criminal psychology, which is law enforcement agencies, education system, research, correction homes, private practice. Introduction. Criminal psychology as a specialized field is relatively new as compared to other specializations under psychology, which is also indicative in the history of criminal psychology. But criminal psychology has become a recognized and progressive field of psychology and research for study. Learning outcome. Students after this are expected to be able to understand role of criminal psychologist, remember scope of criminal psychology, analyze application of criminal psychology in law and legal proceedings. Criminal psychology as a field. Contributions and acceptance of criminal psychology as a specialization appears to have given it the status of an established discipline, which is reflected in the growing number of publications, textbooks and number of professionals who are working in this area. Schuler and Ogloff in 2001 have highlighted the following points which indicate growth of criminal psychology as a field. There is a substantial increase in the number of quality texts. There is an increased number of dedicated research journals in the area of criminal psychology. Also, inclusion of criminal psychology articles in well-established mainstream journals can be evidently seen. Growing interest of professionals and professional bodies in the field of criminal psychology, which are prompting practice and research in this field. Increase in improved undergraduate and postgraduate training opportunities in India and abroad. Recognition of the field as a recognized specialty discipline by APA in the year 2001, though as forensic psychology, but yes, related to criminology. Further, in this module, we will discuss the role of criminal psychologist and scope of criminal psychology. Role of a criminal psychologist. A criminal psychologist is required to perform tasks that are of an investigator, to investigate issues, crimes and crime scenes, profiler to profile that of the crimes and criminals, as a counselor for the victim and criminal, and as a trainer broadly for the personnels dealing with the investigative issues. Following are the role and responsibilities of criminal psychologist in detail. Profiling and psychological testing. A criminal psychologist is required to conduct psychological assessment and screening of individuals in order to provide psychological judgment regarding their crime and criminal intentions. It is to assess individuals using different psychological methods and tools are used, such as interviews, assessment tools, psychometric tests, which can be objective, projective and subjective in nature, which lead to an effective and scientific conclusions. The result of these assessments is very essential as it guides the procedures and trials of court and the other law enforcement forces to formulate the proceedings according to the individual. For instance, A psychologist, if required to test the mental fitness of individuals before they proceed for a trial in the court, as mental fitness will also decide whether they will be able to stand the legal trial or not. Psychological assessment also unveils mental disorders, if any, in the individual, which helps in understanding the intent of the crime and the intensity also. Psychological assessment of criminals enables to understand the personality traits, intelligence levels, attitude, interpersonal issues of the criminal. In recent years, criminal psychologists are also required to do the mental health assessment of law enforcement personnel in order to foster recruitment of professionals who have a skill set and aptitude to work in the legal system. As even in the legal system, the stress and pressure and to be able to understand the context is required. Predicting behavior and actuarial, which is another role of a criminal psychologist. A criminal psychologist is required not only to assess the criminals post-crime, but is also to be able to predict criminal intentions of individuals by conducting rigorous research to identify the reasons that foster criminal behavior. The aim of criminal psychologists while conducting such researches is to understand the biological, social and environmental factors that lead to criminal intent or behavior, as in one of the few studies done by Milgram to understand the criminal intent during the Nazi Act. It is also required to have statistical data of criminal behavior to understand major reasons contributing to criminal intent. This data also enables us to understand the social context in which the crime is increasing and behavior in particular society, religion and culture, which enables us to understand crime in the world. These research and statistical data guides the judiciary and legal authorities to create interventions in order to reduce and control crime. Developing a correction system is another important task that a criminal psychologist is required to undertake. A criminal psychologist is required to work in a holistic manner where after assessment and prediction of a particular behavior, they are also required to formulate intervention, correction and behavior modification plans and interventions to be applied on criminals, which can reform them and lead them to reintegrate in the society. This correction system is specifically made for different groups of criminals, such as children, women and men. The interventions are also required to be specific when required for criminal in relation to the degree of crime conducted, and all criminals cannot be treated with one intervention plan, as that will not lead to the criminal act being stopped. Apart from the criminals, criminal psychologist is also required to plan intervention and training for law enforcement officers to help them maintain their well-being and to guide their interactions with mentally ill criminals. Criminal psychologists are also required to create intervention and counseling program for victims in order to guide them and motivate them to be able to cope with distress. Experimental. A criminal psychologist is also required to conduct experimental research based on specific cases to be able to understand the psychological perspective of the victim, criminal and observers present during the crime scene, as majorly done by Munsterberg also in his studies, and also the legal professionals involved in the case. For instance, if an individual is cognitively disabled or disturbed, how will it change his perception of a stimuli can be well understood and explained by a psychologist after conducting a small experimental study and or by using existing literature present to explain the same. Another important role of a criminal psychologist is advisory. As an advisor, the role of criminal psychologist is to provide advice to law enforcement officers about how to proceed with the investigations, keeping in mind the victim and the criminal psychological aspects. History of criminal psychology indicates the importance of such advisory roles of criminal psychologists in courtroom also, as indicated by Bartle and Bartle. In such situations, a criminal psychologist is required to identify with various factors that may have affected the criminal or the victim or the observers present in the crime scene. And a psychologist can scientifically prove the working of such factors resulting into specific situations, as many studies done in the era wherein Europe, America and other parts of the world clearly studied and integratively studied the scope of scientific evidence to provide factors which may hamper or affect the eyewitness testimony. Expert witness in court is one of such roles of advisory, where a criminal psychologist is required to provide details regarding the effectiveness of eyewitness testimony, effect of suggestibility in eyewitness testimony, and other subjective social and environmental factors described earlier, which may affect the testimonies present during the trials. Though criminal psychology is a growing field, but the next section of this module explains the scope of criminal psychology. Scope of criminal psychology. It is important to know that within the scope of application, a professional in the field of criminal psychology may choose and gain experience in any of the settings. Scope of criminal psychology is not limited but can be summarized as following. First, law enforcement agencies. It is important for law enforcement agencies like police, CRPF, CBI, defense and other law enforcement agencies to have a criminal psychologist on board, as a criminal psychologist is trained to scientifically understand human behavior, and this will help in guiding and understanding the criminal act. In the history of psychology, Nozick and Munsterberg significantly contributed to the literature and indicated the importance of criminal psychologists in mainstream law to help in assessment of criminals not even in the crime scene but also in the court. A criminal psychologist as a part of law enforcement agencies not only works to psychologically assess and counsel criminals but also to simplify the difficulties faced by law enforcement professionals in understanding the psychological reasons leading to a particular behavior. It is while dealing with a case. A criminal psychologist is also required to explain, understand, and reason a case and its related outcomes. Thus, a criminal psychologist may work in direction and in close contact with the legal setting also. A criminal psychologist may also work with family courts to understand and resolve cases related to divorce, domestic violence, acts of crime or criminal intent within the family. Cases related to custody of children and others may also be resolved or seek intervention of a criminal psychologist. A criminal psychologist may also work for child protection, victim rehabilitation, forensic units, CBI, police and other armed forces. Education. As a criminal psychologist and while working in the growing field of criminal psychologists, a criminal psychologist may also be a part of the education system. It is to train professionals for the field of practice and research. Many universities and colleges across the globe have criminal psychology as a specialization, which is as a result of growing need of criminal psychologists in the society and world today. Apart from undergraduate and postgraduate colleges, a criminal psychologist may teach at doctorate level in universities and actively work in the field of criminal psychology by contributing much into theory and research. Research. Research in criminal psychology is like an ocean which is largely unexplored. With the skills to conduct a research in the field of criminal psychology, a psychologist can add to literature, theory and practice of criminal psychology, which is essentially required and is to be used by law and legal authorities today. While conducting experiments may also lead to a better theory development, case study method will help the authorities involved to learn about the existing cases, which have already been presented or resolved by the legal system. Law system in India largely has cases presented to support and describe laws formed and followed by judiciary. It is a growing need to have such cases for psychological issues as well, so that the cases can be guided in a systematic manner. Theoretically, by using a survey research, which can help criminal psychologists to understand tendency of population and criminal intent present in the society. It can also help psychologists to identify issues existing in the society which may lead to crime, and further formulate, test effective intervention and corrective plans to improve such societal and environmental conditions. Correction homes. Correction home is a concept to reform and improve mental health of offenders to help them reintegrate into the society. Such correction homes can be made for specific groups such as sex offenders, juvenile delinquents, women offenders, male offenders. Such correction homes are of great importance in the society, as they not only keep a check on offenders but also stop them from committing heinous crimes. These are initiatives taken by government and non-governmental organizations to give a change and guide offenders and help them improve their lives and overall well-being. Correction homes not only provide counseling and training to these offenders to improve their behavior, but also provides them with a better understanding of self and others. These initiatives play an important role in the survival of humanity and control of crime. A criminal psychologist may also plan to work and open his or her own private practice. In private practice, a criminal psychologist may work in the following areas. Legal advocacy. Legal advocacy suggestions and advice can be given by criminal psychologists in cases where there is a scope of application, such as in cases where minor mentally ill person is involved or in cases where custody of a child is questionable. And advice from a criminal psychologist may also help in divorce cases and cases related to family issues, which are emergent in our society. A criminal psychologist may also plan to work as a counselor as a freelance. As a freelance counselor in private practice, a criminal psychologist may provide counseling in case of divorce, domestic violence, child protection, child rights, human values, human protection, assistance to rape victims, cases of euthanasia, sexual abuse, alcohol or drug abuse, and many other cases. Counseling interventions given by criminal psychologists is not just to enable an individual to fight the case, but many times it also enables them to resolve the case at individual level itself without really filing a case or going to the courtroom. Rehabilitation. This is a wide area of application which ranges from victim to criminal and also for the people who were present in the crime scene. As in case of serious heinous crimes being present in the world, when people have just mere witnessing has really hampered their mental well-being. It is required to provide rehabilitation for criminals who have clinical disorder so that their condition can be controlled and improved for lifestyle management. There are many times that victims are so traumatized that they need professional help. In such cases, an intervention may be provided by a criminal psychologist. It may help in improving the mental state and condition of the victim. In extreme cases, even people who were just present in the crime scene are also affected by the act indirectly, which may lead to conditions of stress, trauma. Thus, seeking a professional help of a criminal psychology may probably solve their problem. Explaining the role and scope of criminal psychology is beyond the scope of any book. Thus, an attempt has been made in this chapter to be able to summarize the role of a criminal psychologist and scope of criminal psychology today. It is to be noted, psychology in itself is a broad field where behavior is studied scientifically. So, where human behavior is involved, moving with the fact that every behavior is under the scope of psychology, it is difficult to state what is beyond the scope of psychology. To summarize, In this module, we have discussed the contributions and acceptance of criminal psychologists as a specialized field, which appears to have given it a status of an established discipline. Role of a criminal psychologist has been discussed as somebody who profiles and does psychological testing. It helps in predicting behavior and actuarial. It helps in developing a correction system, experimental and advisory roles. A criminal psychologist is required to perform tasks that are of an investigator, profiler, counselor and a trainer broadly. It is also important to note that within the scope of application, a professional in the field of criminal psychology may choose and gain experience in any of the settings being explained in this module. Thank you.